Thanks, and good afternoon. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. No Snowmageddon, so the weather held out for us this year. We are very fortunate, as Rihanna pointed out, to have these gentlemen join us on this stage together. I'll highlight a little bit of how challenging it was to wrangle folks at their level into one room at the same time. There's a CIO boot camp also going on today that Vivek and his team have folks sequestered into. But Vivek and his team were very instrumental in reaching out to the folks on the CIO councils at all levels. And he asked us to specifically have representation at the agency and department level, as well as the small agencies. And we're very fortunate to have that. So I'd like to introduce the folks that are joining us. We have Tom Baer from the SEC, Henry Sienkiewicz at DISA, Kevin Smith at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, Keith Trippie, Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security, and Stephen Warren, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Veterans Affairs. So we are going to really focus on several of the challenges and barriers, and then also the opportunities, not only for the agencies and departments that are looking into cloud, but also for folks in the audience that are on their staffs, possibly. I'd like to kind of get a feel with a show of hands of folks that are badge-carrying government employees with maybe an IT or technology mantle that you have to carry daily. Could we get a feel for, we'd like to know who's in the room. Okay, good mix. And then the IT vendor community, the folks who are bringing solutions out, okay? And maybe just a mix of folks that are more solution services versus technology and integration. If we have folks from the Boos and the Capgeminis or Accentures in the audience, looks like we have a few here. It's always nice to know. We're going to try and cover this from a lot of different angles, but really bring it back to those barriers and challenges that these agencies and these gentlemen here and their staffs are going to be facing moving forward. We're also going to leverage the input data that was provided earlier today. So if you were not in the room, we'll highlight a few of those slides specifically, and then retouch on some of those points as the basis for the panel discussion and the dialogue that we're going to have. I want to point out two things. As I was putting this panel together and trying to organize it, there were two kind of funny occurrences that kind of racked my sanity units. One that Henry was involved with, we tried to do a pre-conference call using GoToMeeting. And Henry informed all of us that DISA does not allow GoToMeeting any employee to use that for an outside source. So that was something that kind of gave me a little bit of pause up front and said, well, maybe that's a topic that we could hit on in the panel. The second one was the third person that I reached out to was Jim Gallagher at the Library of Congress. And I introduced myself as Mike Binko from CloudTrack, and he said, oh, wait a minute, you're looking for Noah. And then he laughed. He let me off the hook. But that taxed my sanity units as well, and I said, okay, these guys are all looking at cloud, and they're going to have to look at cloud, and that's the reaction I got. But we're very fortunate these folks have joined us. And I think you're going to hear some perspective of what's happening in the trenches of culture shift, of employee management, workforce management, some of the issues that need to be leveled out with their teams before they can make a pure cloud approach and maybe even integrate their existing software and technology platforms to the cloud. So with that, we're going to try and move forward. I'll make sure this is working. I'd like to give credit where credit's due. Denise Peterson at Input, I'm not sure if she's here, but I know Kevin was here earlier this morning. Some of the data is similar to Kevin's presentation, but Denise was the one who presented this in the pre-webinar that we did with some of the other vendors in Information Week. And it's really her top 5 reasons why cloud is here to stay for government. So we're just going to hit on those real quick. And this slide looks familiar if you were here for Kevin. Basically, the perceptions of cloud computing and where there's some challenges still in place and some areas where the agencies and departments are moving forward and putting some good pilots and actually real deployments in place. Cutting across the security factors being still primary concern. Integration of existing vendor platforms is obviously one that's bubbling up to the top. And then also the pure total cost of ownership and the savings, and how do you put value metrics on that? What's the return on investment for cloud for these agencies? As far as the top 5 reasons, the vendor solutions poised to meet agency demand, that was something that Denise and Kevin have highlighted very quickly on. We in the vendor community have to be open to the needs that the agencies and departments are looking for, but we also have to be able to work with each other, and that's an environment that cloud has to breed, and we have to be successful in doing that. So we're going to hit on that a little bit. Standards and portability, I think with Dawn's presentation and the folks from NIST that are here, if you're not involved with the taxonomy programs or the use case scenarios, I would invite you as vendors or solution providers and agency decision makers to get involved. It's a very well thought out program, and it's in the right hands with NIST. Early adopters, I think we've seen some good examples with USDA. We're going to hear from NASA and folks later. The gentlemen on the stage here also represent, we're going to ask them to talk about some of the pilot programs that they're already moving to the cloud or have moved to the cloud, maybe even beyond pilot. And then under the 25-point plan that Vivek and Jeff announced at the end of the year, there are specific requirements that agencies identify at least 3 programs, I think in the next 12 or 18 months, that are at least identified and moving towards it. Security and certification, we won't really hit on that too much because we had some other panels that really touched on that in depth, and once again invite you to get involved with those programs. Policy and enforcement. Not sure teeth is the right word or the way I would explain it, but there's a real guidance coming out from the administration and through the CIO councils and through NIST on how to take a measured approach to cloud. So we want to hit on those points. As far as the vendor opportunities and challenges that we need to pay attention to, so for folks in the audience here, input brought up the low-risk solutions are a good place to start, and we're seeing that. You'll have a vendor panel this afternoon with Google and Microsoft and Red Hat, Amazon and others to talk about where they're bringing their solutions out and where the first deployments are going from their perspective. And I hope that that panel also talks about the interoperability. We have the private versus public and the hybrid private-public cloud discussion that's raging, and we hope to hit on that as well. And then really to be determined, with the fiscal year budget getting a lot of attention from the political ranks, I think the folks that are going to have the rubber hit the road here at the agencies maybe could give us some perspective on how they're navigating some of the budget challenges that face them moving forward. From our perspective as vendors, we also want to really concentrate on the items in red on the slide here, really what we're going to concentrate on in the panel. Gaining customer buy-in. You're seeing the use cases come out, the pilot scenarios, and measuring ROI is a critical factor. Something that we really have wrangled with and grabbed as part of our DNA is what we call Cloud 2.0. Trademark that term, and it really is taking cloud from basic office productivity activities to business process management, collaboration, compliance, some of the more sophisticated applications in the cloud. So with that, let me introduce the first topic that the panelists can wrangle with here is workforce management. One of the items that input brought up was a cultural shift and some of the factors that come into play with your staffs working with a new environment or architecture such as cloud. I think, Keith, you had mentioned that in an early discussion that we had, that's a key point that you guys are facing right now.
Right, so I see this, the whole concept around the cloud or the multi-tenant on-demand environment, I look at it more as a business model shift, right? So with a business model shift, it's not just technology. It's the folks that you're going to be, leveraging partnerships with to go get that work done, and the staff that works for you. So what I think you're going to start seeing over time is federal agencies having to wrestle with, well, if I've got staff that's been on a long time, they've been turning the screwdrivers on the backs of the boxes for the past 20 years. How do we address what their future will look like? So do we move them up the stack, and it's more around performance management, SLAs, and oversight, and getting them engaged on the buy-in to where that makes sense, that they want to be a part of that. Also, I would look at the opportunities around, as you're looking at new feds to bring on board, let's bump them up the stack and maybe look at more folks around the business layer. Let's have those business layer discussions with our customers. Let's look for opportunities for reuse at the application layer across a particular agency and across federal agencies writ large.
Others on the panel that have a similar perspective or maybe some alternative approach?
Go ahead.
Okay, first of all, on behalf of Lieutenant General Pollitt and the rest of the DISA team, I always like saying thank you for the opportunity to have this type of engagement, because quite frankly, we learn an awful lot through this, and I mean, I'm just very fortunate because it's a great panel, and some of us have talked together before, and it's just always great to hear these perspectives. For those of you who don't know what DISA does, I would characterize us as that institutional provider of complex IT services. We run networks, we run satellites, we have a whole bunch of program executive offices. But in this cloud construct, we also run data centers. We have 14 data centers. We have about 3,800 people. So I actually have two challenges here. I have challenge one as that internal provider of services, and I've got my DASTIN team here who are integral to my success as a CIO from providing internal support here. And I mean, as we're moving and we're shifting our support, I mean, the DASTIN team can probably comment a little bit about how we're trying to craft that type of workforce, because it is a different set of skills. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's a very different set of skills that you have to bring to bear. And as we're migrating these service offerings into a new environment, I mean, we have to teach the team and we have to bring them along and find the right skills mix. But at the other side, I mean, as a service provider, I've got that other challenge of finding the right talent to be able to go there and support the rest of the agencies, the rest of the department. DISA has, as I said, these 14 data centers. I mean, we run the rapid access computing environment. We've got global content delivery. We have Forge.mil. We have this whole list of things. We have our own collaboration system, DCO, thank you, which works wonderful for doing this type of collaborative meeting, which is the internal joke. And then for all of you who may not be aware of it, we're also the provider for the Army as the first customer of enterprise email for the department. I mean, next year at this point in time, I'm expecting to have about 1.7 million users on a enterprise email offering for the department, obviously with the Army as the first customer. And if that has not been a security challenge for my security team, I don't know what is. A scalability, a storage. I mean, it's a whole series of nuances from the government provider of these services as well as the consumer on saying, how do I migrate all of these people? How do I migrate 1.7 million users from their own individual email system into a new environment and teach all of these systems administrators the right skills, the right ways to do it? And so, I mean, that's some of those things that we talk about daily.
Yeah, a little bit of best practice management, but also maybe you know, some of the other folks on the panel could address it. For the folks that are badge-carrying folks in the technology ranks, you know, they're going to need to approach their bosses at some point under a review. And if cloud is a major initiative, maybe what are some of the skill sets that you might advise folks to understand or get involved with that they can maybe align themselves to be participants in the cloud movement?
Yeah. So one, from a good news perspective from the SEC, we essentially have about 80% of our IT staff are contractors, and so movement into the cloud is actually easy for us to do from a workforce management perspective. We don't have the skills in-house, and so we are looking for opportunities to move applications as quickly as possible. Half of my staff meets the requirements of business management and service level management and technology and product management leads, and so I think my team is poised to move into the cloud fairly easily, and we don't have the standard types of workforce management issues that other teams have. And so I'm investing with my staff program management, business systems analyst skills, and other skills that we will utilize in a cloud computing environment and a heavily outsourced environment going forward.
And I think many of you that have had also private sector experience and history, maybe bringing some of that approach to your teams as well is you know, maybe yielding some results.
Yes.
Kevin and Stefan, your approaches with your staff and your teams in preparing for this wave of cloud.
At the USPTO, I mean, our approach, I don't have the exact numbers of our internal FTE support versus contractors, but I'd have to say when you look at this from the empathetic standpoint, when you're an employee down there supporting infrastructure, the first thing you think of, infrastructure as a service, what about me? And we're going through gripping that conversation with our employees to say, well, what should we do? What are the training skills that we need to bring in? What are some of the programs we can do to educate our employees going forward? And the approach we've taken, I think, is a lot of the similar approaches across the board. So we're going to build a private cloud internal. Use hopefully the same technology internal. We're embracing the open source type view of the cloud and vendor neutrality to look at interactions with public clouds. And we're going to have to build something internally to give some on-the-job training for our employees to get them ready to move forward. It's an obstacle that every agency is going to have at a different standpoint from the SEC, maybe not the same standpoint, but it's something we have to address before we fully move. And it's just something we look for the crowd to appreciate and offer advice, if there is any, on better ways to do it. It's definitely an issue.
So I would say we're probably a macrocosm of everything talked about, given the fact that we're the largest consolidated IT organization on the civilian side. So we have our end strength from an IT workforce standpoint that all work within my organization. They work for me. I'm the senior career person at the VA. We have 7,300 IT employees. So I mean, that's the total workforce. And our annual spend is, if we have 2-year appropriations, so it carries forward. So our annual spend is $4 billion a year, IT spend. So that's the size of the enterprise we talk about. So we have a little bit of everything that was discussed. You want to move your staff up the value chain. And so we're looking at how do you move them away from something that's a commodity skill into something that's adding value into the enterprise. So how do you train them? How do you give them those opportunities to move up? We have a mix of build our own cloud, but we figured out a long time ago that y'all out there in the community, you do this a heck of a lot better than us because you've got to do it on those thin margins to survive. So we actually have a production system, the new GI Bill, which rolled out. That is in a private cloud, does not sit at a VA facility. Sits at a vendor facility. It's physically isolated. We've processed 500,000 veterans applications through that, and we've done outlays of $8.4 billion so far. Not a pilot. So full production, full mission delivery using cloud. Private cloud because we needed to deal with the information, but private cloud at a commercial facility. So training the staff we have to move them up the value chain. We experiment with our own clouds because you got to make sure the staff understand what it is, so when they're managing the service levels, when they're managing the performance, they need to know what it is. It's not just something on a piece of paper. They've experienced it. They've lived with it. But we're looking at this mix. Go to private cloud, commercial locations make sense for us. If we need to do it in-house, we'll do it in-house, but it's not our preference. And making sure our staff, again, have the opportunity to grow into those areas. But we also have some old systems, if you will. We're still running some mainframe systems that were designed in the 70s. We're still going to need folks to run. So there's an opportunity for staff to decide, what do I want to do? Do I want to grow into this new area? Do I want to move up the value chain? Or do I want to finish my service supporting some of those legacy systems that we still count on?
Well, you've hit on a couple of other topics that we're going to touch on here, so great transition. So moving up the value chain, we've seen it on the commercial side and some of the other sectors that we serve at CloudTrack, financial services, healthcare, medical, and pharma, where the CIO teams are able to sit more at the boardroom level where they can hand off some of the grunt work of managing systems and lights and buttons to vendors like us, and then allow them to sit with their peers at the COO, and we're even seeing CCOs getting budget that was traditionally clearly in the CIO camp, and making their own IT decisions even without consultation. So some of those challenges, and I'm sure risks from a CIO and staff perspective, present opportunity to sit at a more strategic level with your teams, but also some challenges when we get into the procurement and the budgeting moving forward. So on to topic 2, who owns the data and the IP? Basically, you know, the business rules of moving on a transformational shift to cloud architecture. And I think, Stefan, you had brought this up as one main topic, so maybe if you could touch on it real quickly.
Sure. And I talked about the fact that we have a full production system doing basically delivery of veterans benefits already today. That was something that was basically put together over the last 2 years. So really system up and running, it's been about 12, 14 months. But as we did that, there was a evolution of thinking, not just by our folks, but also by the provider that we use to understand how do you make sure they're actually just providing the cycles. I don't care about the boxes, right? I don't care about upgrade level, I don't care about patch level, as long as it meets the security standard. I don't have the folks doing it, I don't care as long as it meets the standard. But the thing we needed to make sure we did, and this was an evolution on our part, was to make sure when the contract went in place, our folks understood and the provider understood we're not giving the data away, right? We're not giving the business rules away. So as we make that transition to another vendor, if it happens, if you do this, you need to make sure you know how to do that. Because if you get into a situation where your contract's about to expire and you want to go to somebody else and they own your business rules, you got a problem, right? Because now you're going to pay not only to get out, but also to get in. So you've got to think that through. So we spent a lot of time working that through. And the IP truly is the business rule. What is your business? It's the piece that we care about, right? As a government entity, it's the thing we need to care about. Unless it's a commodity service, then I don't care. But if it's a thing that's core to the veterans, taking care of those veterans, providing those services and benefits, it's something we need to make sure we own and we know where it is and how we transition it if we transition it.
And obviously with taxpayer dollars at work, they play in that IP as well, and being able to replicate that in an efficient way,
Yes.
in an efficient manner across vendors is important. Anybody else on the panel have a thought on that, Tom?
Yeah, we have 25 applications at the SEC that are in the cloud. They're all commercially available, off-the-shelf applications, with some with unique business rules. And all of our vendor contracts indicate that we own the data and also the workflow or the IP associated with the management of those systems. And we're moving more into the cloud, and again, that will be a prerequisite that our data has to be secure, it has to be owned by us, and we have to own the business rules, many of which are unique to the enforcement actions of the SEC.
I would only I would only add that in this entire change, this world is changing underneath us. The thing that's not going to change is we own the data before. We want to continue to own the data. We own the IP before. We'll continue to own the IP after. What happens underneath that, say, application tier? I don't think any of us are really fighting to stay in that business. Meet the performance, meet the SLA. We'll take the IP and the data as long as it's portable. Let's have that discussion. But to continue down this old path, it's a nice shift on the business side. But we own the data, and we'll keep the IP.
And I think as vendors, we in that community need to realize that that's the status quo. That needs to be the case that you approach the government with to begin with. But then understanding that there is an element of, hey, if new novel methodologies are created that you can then leverage and commercialize, you know, government agencies aren't necessarily in the market of commercializing their methodologies and IP, so it's not necessarily going to be a risk point for you. Certainly NIST being an alternative there. Anyone else have a perspective on that topic?
I think probably the message for the business community, there is no long-term lock-in based upon cloud, right? And that's, we still run across some folks who don't get that, but it isn't a guarantee of 50 years of revenue, right? Don't work that way.
Yeah, actually, I think that's going to lead into the very next discussion about licensing and procurement.
Yeah.
You got it.
So I'll just leave that as the message.
Okay. So with that acquisition shift, the licensing procurement, I think we've seen obviously with GSA, you know, taking a first, you had to start somewhere. And I think the administration had to start somewhere with some guidelines and focal points. And you've seen, you know, the data center consolidation is a natural place to start. I think Kevin touched on it in the input data earlier. It is where your biggest bang for the buck can occur if it's done in a measured and manageable way with a prioritization of ROI. What's the next shoe to drop? Is it the application side? Is it the, you know, bringing new capabilities out that are managed by maybe government agencies and shared across the government environment? So a little bit of perspective from you guys as you look into how are you going to procure and what are some of the pilots that you might be looking to put under the three that you might have to have in place? And I know most of you here already have several in process, so it may not apply to you, but could you give a snapshot from your minds and working with your procurement teams and contracting teams, how are you approaching the subtle changes that are going to happen in the next couple of years? And maybe not so subtle.
I have a little energy on this topic. I think there may be some few others here that do as well. Again, back to the business model changing. For years, we've been heavy into CapEx on the federal side. And one of the things I like about this opportunity is let's look at flipping that model around a little bit and sharing some of that capital expenditure risk with our vendor community, right? So as these cloud services are being stood up, open source is out there, so that's driving some costs down. The old licensing model, which is very complex, I think, to all of us, and I think needlessly so. I understand why it's done, but I would argue that the folks that are willing to change and develop a revenue model that works for your company or your shareholders, I think that if you can get out in front of that and provide a model that's a pay for what you use as opposed to buy a whole bunch of it, have it sit on the bookshelf, and whether you use it or not, pay me the 20% on an O&M basis every year, it's probably not the best model for us. So we're, I think, collectively on the group, I don't want to speak for all of us, but I think that we all have a lot of energy at the acquisition model. We'll work with our contracts folks, but I expect that I would think that the vendor community is going to be taking those steps. And some of you in the vendor community are. I would think that over time, as more of you do that, I think that you're going to see a shift in this business model that will be transformative, which is where I hope this cloud allows us to go.
And Kevin, one thought specifically that I think was brought up in one of our pre-calls is that, you know, with USPTO, you guys have data that is public, you know, consumer-facing data from applications and being able to research and track applications and grants. but you also then have quite a bit of internal and expertise where you may need to have a secure collaboration on evaluations. And I would imagine balancing that is a little bit of a challenge for an organization like USPTO as opposed to some other agencies that are more internally focused on their data management.
No, it is a little different. It could fit in the licensing and procurement side too. Just from a high-level description, the Patent and Trademark Office is a business. It is a performance-based organization in the government, totally self-funded as far as going forward with what we do. We pull in money from application fees, and we deliver service to our customers. And so it's a factory. It's an intellectual property factory where quarterly we have huge spikes at the end of quarters for people to meet their quotas, because it's a paycheck for everybody who's an examiner. Their paycheck depends on our systems and their availability. And so when you look at the licensing standpoint of it, things we're looking at targeting outside of the email and the collaboration things is the search and retrieval of patent information and trademark information. Over a year, or not over a year ago, all the patent information, it's called public PAIR, Patent Application Information Retrieval, is actually out there. It's out on Google right now, totally available to the public. We're fully supporting transparency of public data. From the standpoint of when it gets difficult for us, is that when someone files for a trademark, it's immediately public available data. We can put that out on a public cloud with no hesitation, just a matter of making sure the system's internal work with it and things are fine. Patents are a tad different. 18 months, the first one the patent is submitted, for 18 months it's private data. Anything that's considered national security is actually not even in our system. It's put in paper actually and shipped around the country to other agencies in the military to actually go through the examination of that type of material. But for the first 18 months of a patent, it's not public data, it's private. So we have to go through a shift of how do we keep the authoritative data source of all patents internal to the USPTO and make sure that if we're going to offload the search and retrieval to make sure when we get data mined in the public side that it's somewhere else, doesn't affect our systems. How do we keep those two data sources in touch and together? And the way I'd pull it into the licensing side is, well, obviously we're storing the data twice right now. Any way we can not pay for just the glass, just pay for the drink would be very, very nice. It'd make it a lot more reasonable for us, but we know it's a building model from the vendor side as well. But
we see with that start small and scale model that we need to be flexible as a vendor to say a user that is maybe a public consumer, and we've seen this at the state and local level. We have a county court system down in Florida that basically has to make redacted court records available in a timely manner. And they don't want to pay as much for that license of someone viewing our system as they would for a compliance officer or a legal person internally making a determination on data in the system. And it's all about stakeholder and level of rights into the system. So I would say we as vendors need to be prepared to break down the access into our systems at a rights level to the different application modules and sets of data at the database level.
And I think it's also part of the competitive model, right? So I mean, if you look at the whole, how open source has evolved, it's usually there's a first mover in the market, and there's a second and third who've said, well, let me attack their piece of the stack, and I'm going to hop up one. So when we're going out and we're buying services, your competitive model is based upon what the cost is you're going to charge for the cycles we're going to consume. So it's a business decision that you need to make in terms of how you build that service. And so from our standpoint, we actually don't care what's underneath it, as long as it meets the security standards, and we're going to talk on a pricing basis, right? So that's where you need to start making some decisions. And I think it's going to impact the software industry in terms of where do you charge the marginal increase because of the proprietary nature and the license of it versus the service piece, which is the knowledge of the product and how do I make it sing to my tune. And there's a trade-off between the two. It's not the industry is going to go away. The funding model is going to change, and I think cloud is going to impact that. What's the business model that the different offerings are going to bring to the table, and what level do you need to bring it at? And based upon what it is, you're going to look at what are the pieces in the stack you need to provide it, and which one do you want to use. It really isn't, I like this one or I like that one. What's the business model? Where's the value on it?
And I think I'm going to talk a little bit from a provider as well as a consumer of these services. I think for all of you who may not be aware of this, DISA shifted some of our acquisition model into a service offering about almost 7 years ago now. So inside those 14 data centers, we don't actually own those physical assets. We acquire them as services under our capacity services contracts. For all of you who are in that business, that contract is up for renewal. As the Klinger-Cohen guy, I signed off on the statement a little while ago, and it's about $500 million worth of hardware and storage that's going out to the street. So just so you all know, this is all public, I believe. I mean, the vendor community has already been tracking it. I don't see Jason back there writing feverishly because I know this is not new news. But I mean, you know that most of you in this room are very cognizant of the fact that we don't own these assets. We buy them as services, very much along that platform as a service model. Do we believe that it was the right answer? We do believe it was the right answer at that point in time. However, the new contract is such that it will be very open to however the offerers come forward back to us to say, we might have a better way of you doing your business. But recognize that at this point in time, we don't buy these things as a hard asset that belongs to the government. We buy utilization of mainframes, of servers, of storage. And that's how we clearly believe we're going forward. For those of you who have heard us talk on this topic before, right now I can bring into those data centers capacity within 30 days. I mean, for those who have gone through the acquisition, the normal government acquisition cycle, those are beautiful times. Do we think we could get faster? I don't know. I mean, quite frankly, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much faster we need to be to bring in a brand new mainframe into an environment, because there's all the other security stuff that we have to get through. The other contract that you all need to be sort of tracking in on is DCO. I mean, the DCO, our defense collaboration system that we were just joking about, I mean, I think, again, well known in the vendor community that, I mean, it's coming back up for an offering. It is very much a software as a service offering. We buy a service. We don't own the asset. So just, again, some of these things that we've worked with you in the past to figure out how we deliver. We right now do buy it as a full-up service. I mean, we pay for it. We centrally fund it. And I think that's the problem that we all have to juggle through as we go forward, is the idea of how do we pay for these enterprise services? How do we go there and find the right acquisition path to be able to acquire them as an appropriate service? Because when you look at inside the department, I have got people who use office productivity and mail and collaborative services. And the question is, who has to pay what part of the bill? And I think we are still trying to wrestle with that as an answer. So I mean, there's that whole notion of acquisition. And to be quite frank, I've told this to the acquisition community. I've spoken at DoD acquisition panels, and it's like, okay, guys, so you need to help us figure this out. And we've talked at pretty much every level inside the department. We've got to figure out how we do this from a central service. But at the same time, I mean, for some of the vendors in the room, some of you all have these things that you think are going to be the neatest thing and the best piece of sliced bread that the department is going to be able to consume in the future. But the question is, where is the real market traction? And we still haven't figured that out. We talk about open source and government purpose rights, and I think you all know that DISA has rolled out a thing called forge.mil, which is our version of the open source community. And the question is, once we have a certain utilization rate, we still have to come to grips with how do we actually go there and move it from this test dev environment to a real production environment and actually have a maintenance trail behind it. So we haven't come to grips with how do we go there and identify these things as service offerings, and recognizing that we're all faced with a whole series of budgetary challenges in the near future. I mean, I'm not going to comment about any of the ongoing initiatives. I mean, quite frankly, I don't know that much. My head is very much in moving DISA from here in Washington up to Fort Meade, Maryland right now. But we've got to come to grips with how do we go there and find the right way to go there and support this. Because once these applications are in the production environment, the very last thing I'm going to allow the warfighters to have is something that I can't figure out who I can call in the middle of the night to say, you need to fix this right now. I mean, and that's part of this whole challenge that we're going through a year plus, year and a half into the fielding of our open source government purpose rights community. So, I mean, so as you do this, I mean, we're open to offers, but some of these applications, we don't quite know what really is scalable and what actually is appropriate. So.
One thought on the acquisition and procurement side, just from the vendor community, I've heard it from several folks absorbing the presentations in the 25-point plan is, yes, there's mechanisms through GSA and other sources that are making it a little bit more streamlined to get the ICE capabilities or the data center consolidation. From your perspectives, with maybe procurements that are in place, without having to wait for the pre-solicitations, the RFIs and RFPs, are there maybe an approach where vendors can engage with the contracting teams on task areas that are in place that may not necessarily need to be redefined and re-procured as cloud specifically, but there may be capabilities that could be injected into those procurements as a cloud capability and maybe also solve some of the transition of applications and business process to the cloud?
We actually have set up a technical acquisition center in New Jersey. So thank you, CCOM. I think the Army's still upset with us, but that's a separate issue. So we have the whole team, and they basically do all our acquisitions. And so they're open to that engagement. I mean, they have collaboration websites set up where we're looking for folks to come in to say, you went out this way, you have this particular thing. We think a different way to approach this is. So the team is there. They've got a strong technical background as well as a strong acquisition background. And so we're looking at them to do that. We have a couple of RFIs coming out because we still think that's a good model. We think coming out and saying, this is what we're trying to do. Tell us, do we have this right? So we have one coming up for a full integrated suite, not just email, because email in the cloud really doesn't do anything, because if it doesn't have encryption, if it doesn't have records management, if it doesn't have all the things you need to do as part of that productivity service, it doesn't get you anywhere. So that one's coming out on the street as an RFI to say, this is what we're thinking of, and we're open to what's the right answer. And that's the model we like. It takes a little bit longer, but it allows us to state the outcome we're looking for without preconceived notions. And we're working with our workforce to understand, no, you don't need to get a box for every new thing. No, you don't need to have software license for everything. You need an assured service that you're going to use. We're working with DISA in terms of using them as a provider. We have our own franchise fund, which also runs data centers, so we'll look at them as a provider. So we're looking at the full gamut. And we're fortunate that we're large enough to experiment and to figure out how do we do that. Because not only are we an integrated healthcare system, which is fully electronic, we're also an insurance system, we're a banking system, we're a benefit system, and oh, by the way, I've got 380,000 employees I need to service. So all of those things, different models, different approaches for the different mission needs.
And just to follow up on what Stefan said is that, I mean, one, it is a very good collaboration that's going on between DISA, because we run Alta for the department, and what Stefan's team is doing for the rest of the VA healthcare system. I mean, the White House has been very clear on trying to make sure that we are much more tightly coupled, because it is a holistic approach to healthcare and other benefits to the service members. But he started to allude to some other things that I think we're all still wrestling with, which is this notion of how do we find the right holistic piece on there, because it isn't just the point solutions. Because while we're looking inside of the DISA family on enterprise email, we're also looking at enterprise SharePoint or other types of collaborative tools out there. And again, we're going to have to wrestle through all of the governance that goes along with it. Not just the funding, but how do we go there and say, okay, well, this person gets this type of nomenclature to go with it, and there's a whole data architecture piece that goes, and I'm watching smiles on the panel, because it's sort of a nightmare for all of us to try to do this, to provide it as an enterprise service out to the cloud. So when you're looking at your cloud solutions, and you're trying to say, how do you scale to the size that we're talking about? Because we're just enormous businesses. I mean, yeah, I mean, we would be in that nice tier of those Fortune 500 guys very, very rapidly. But I mean, our problems are that we have to have like a standard data architecture so that we can go there and plug it and play it. We have to have that standardized information architecture so that security guys, I mean, because one of my other roles is as the DISA DAA, so I am the accreditor for it, so I'm really paranoid about these things. And I'm watching, again, the smiles going on. I mean, you've got to recognize that we've got to take all of these things into account. So it's not as if we can just go there and say, yeah, there's a great service, let's go and move. There's a whole level of appropriateness. I mean, this notion of how do we have standardized office productivity applications. We've looked at a thing that we call vOffice, which is a virtual online office application. We don't know where it is right now. I mean, we obviously have been focusing a lot of our talent on enterprise email. but the question is, where do we go next? Because we know that there's a next out there, and it is, as we were talking about earlier, moving up in that value chain.
Yeah, I would just add, I'm not a procurement expert. If I was, I'd be at a different panel. But I'd have to say, do a little homework every once in a while is nothing that the government can't do. We're allowed to do market analysis. And I just wanted to point the group to on CIO.gov. I don't know if everyone's seen the Mythbusters document that's out there that talks about, based on federal acquisition regulations, what are we allowed or not allowed to do? And it's a tight balance between what we're allowed to and not allowed to do to make sure that we're doing the right thing for the government as well as for the vendor community. But you're allowed to go ask the questions. Can I, go read that document, look at it, and ask who you're working with. Can I come talk to you? Can we do market research and see where you can go? I don't want to give you the answer of we're allowed to do it, but read that Mythbusters doc and see if it helps you see how to interface with who you're dealing with at what agency.
And I know this topic particularly could be a panel, actually a full session for an event for the day, but in the nature of time management, we'll move on to the platform and vendor interoperability. One question I kind of like to approach it with, Keith, I think in the pre-call you brought up that there are several different, I guess in the last 10 years, the consolidation of agencies within DHS can often present a challenge with different systems that are either stovepipe, never had to talk to each other before. So I wonder if you might be able to touch on that. And then, Tom, not to put you on the spot, but I remember after the Madoff scandal, I remember watching C-SPAN, and the Inspector General of the SEC was kind of getting blazed a little bit about, is there a mechanism where we can make these systems talk to each other and things may not fall through the cracks? So not to put you on the hot seat, but I know that was an initiative that you guys have really jumped on aggressively. And those are some of the applications that we as a vendor would like to be able to showcase what we could do in secure collaboration in those types of areas of compliance. So, and then the others on the panel, just what do you need from us as vendors to be able to do with our peers?
So I'll kick it off. So we're a relatively small group, a couple 100,000 feds and strong, and we've got a bunch of different missions, a bunch of different dynamics, a bunch of legacy applications, well into the hundreds and hundreds of legacy applications. And so part of the challenge that we've got is, as we establish, and just real quick, I'll thumbnail these, for the cloud offerings that we're going out on the cloud first, we're going to sweep the deck with the public websites, move those out to the GSA service offering. Identity proofing in the cloud, which is an effort we're working on with CIS for work authorization. Another one is in our private cloud. So we've got sensitive data that will, for the foreseeable future, stay in our private cloud. We've got non-sensitive data, we'll sweep the deck, move that out to the public cloud. So what I'm referring to here is inside of our private cloud, we've got services that we're going to stand up around productivity, general computing, dev test, mobile, VDI. These are all things that are coming on the horizon that we're going to be rolling out over the next 18 to 24 months as a service. To do that, one of the things that we've got to bake into that architecture is things like NEAM. The department plays the lead role in the federal space on NEAM. So how do we share information better than we could before? So as we look at products and services that are out there, NEAM is certainly an interoperability standard that we're going to look more closely at. Open architecture is a strong area of focus for us as we go forward, because we are not able to complete our mission. CBP, ICE, TSA, Coast Guard, we're all intricately interwoven across our space. And for us, you may have a truck driver that goes through, does his job during the day, then gets on a bus, and then gets on a plane, and then gets on a boat and a cruise, and it's all the way through that life cycle. We've got to be able to understand how we're sharing that information to make sure that we're protecting the homeland, as well as supporting commerce and trade and all of the other functions that we have. So interoperability is a huge component of where we're going. We'd really like for the vendor community to take that on and make sure that your services, if they're proprietary in nature, that's not going to do us any good. So I don't know how that's going to do you any good if you're coming to our door saying we've got some proprietary services for you.
And then obviously when DHS needs to extend out to local, state, local, municipal law enforcement folks for certain issues, it just compounds the challenge.
Absolutely. So the standards that are out there at the state and local levels with our private sector partners, we've got to be able to share information, and all of those legacy systems today don't necessarily talk, but over time we'd like to get a glide path to where there is interoperability to share information, whether it's during a mission exercise, whether it's just for day to day. I mean, that is a critical component of our state and local and private sector communications.
And I'm obviously, Tom, with SEC, liaising with regulatory bodies such as FINRA and others for public markets and such.
Yes. So we at the SEC intake a huge amount of data, both in our EDGAR corporate financial filing system as well as through Dodd-Frank, and then our oversight of the SROs such as FINRA. We intake a tremendous amount of data. We have to analyze that data. And we also, very much like the Patent Office, we have a public-facing portion, both of the EDGAR filer system, which is a commercial offering that we sell, and we have a public view of that, sec.gov. And so we have about 18.5 million hits per day on sec.gov, mostly looking at corporate information that we house in our databases and that we display for the investor public. So it's important for us to have database tools that interoperate well so that we can analyze the data, intake the data, and also display it out into the public. And your comment or question about the tips, complaints, and referrals capability, we are developing a comprehensive workflow engine that using commercial off-the-shelf software that we utilize for the intake of tips and complaints, like the Madoff tip referrals that we were talking about. And we also use it in our enforcement areas as well as our investigation areas. And so the same set of data we are looking to analyze that data, and as we intake it, investigate, and then enforce in our enforcement actions, we want to make sure that the data is accessible and able to be analyzed through all of our different divisions.
I think probably, I know you're trying to run the clock, the piece that, and it sort of fits into the comments a couple of us made earlier, it's standards, right? So this isn't vendor lock-in, it isn't a new lock-in model, it's how do you build something that allows that flow of information, the flow of capability. Whether you team with somebody, whether you do it yourself, whether it's a consortium, what you need to make sure is when you bring the offering to the table, there are no chinks in it from a security standpoint, and it's seamless for the first person using it. So the multiple models we're looking at, our AITCs trying to figure out how do they buy capacity such that they can pipe it in when we need it versus them building it themselves. Looking at what DISA can provide for us. We work through SPAWAR in the Navy, who helped us on the GI Bill. We're using them also as part of our whole redesign of our benefits program. That's $400 billion a year in outlays. So again, we're looking at how do you do that. No one vendor can do. So if you're building the greatest thing and it's yours and it's fenced and boxed and nobody else can do it, you may do it as a niche player, but it's not going to work. You got to figure out how do you work across, how do you bring the capacity to bear that you can team, you can combine, and you can scale appropriately. Whether you do it, again, as a team, as a collaboration, as a consortium, that's key. And it may be a mix between government located and private located, based upon what pieces of the data model needs to stay in and what needs to move out. So I think a lot of the standards work that's taking place is critical. Keep doing that. There's a tremendous value there. But don't fight over who owns which one. Figure out how you get there so we can use it. Because otherwise, you're going to lock yourself out of that market.
And we've found as a vendor that, in some of the engagements I mentioned, Brevard County in Florida, we've had to integrate with 4-version-old Informix databases under IBM that are running along quite nicely. Nobody knew it was Informix until they realized they needed to integrate and extend that data for a compliance purpose to the cloud, and they were able to do it very quickly. For a matter of time, because we do want to allow some questions, I'll just ask everybody on the panel to kind of run through maybe the top return on investment factors. How are you prioritizing and measuring the return on cloud? Is it just total cost of ownership? Is it beyond that with workforce productivity? Is it being able to engage your team in more strategic activities for your departments and agencies?
I'll start.
Henry, go ahead.
Yeah. And you see, because I don't necessarily like to characterize it as a return on investment. I'd rather characterize it as a return on value, because what we're trying to do is figure out the right way to deliver information out to, obviously, our constituency in all of its permutations. And I think the best example I'll use is what we call APAN, the All Partners Access Network, which for us was is very much a cloud-like offering. It's a collaborative environment. If you haven't looked it up, go out. You can do the search on your favorite search engine and go and type in APAN. And there's one thing there, and then there's us. And for us, that was the way that we provided relief operations in Haiti. Direct, immediate. Whole series of non-traditional partners. I mean, these were partners, NGOs, governments that, quite frankly, we don't necessarily have direct military dealings with, or in some cases, direct diplomatic dealings with, all collaborating in the exact same environment, run inside a DoD center, enclaved off. Software came from Pacific Command, so we grabbed it from one of our mission partners, we used it, we stood it up, but for us, what it was able to provide was immediate, real-time situational awareness. And for us, obviously inside the department, that's critical to our success. I mean, when we're able to go there and use this system to direct someone to go there and dig someone out from a building and save their lives, for us, that is a measurement of success. And so our mission set, our return on value analysis, is that if I can go there and figure out how I go there and tell someone you need to avoid this route on this road because there is a bad guy there, that's my return on value. Okay.
So it would be nice to have return on value as the thing we need to do, but again, in consideration the hearings taking place and where we as a nation need to go, it is a return on investment. And I think the thing you need to be careful about is don't overplay or overstate what the value is. We're finding that unless it's a public cloud deployment where you really don't care what's underneath it, the cost is not less for private clouds. So unless folks have come in with some interesting things, given the physical separation, it's not logical separation, it's physical separation. A private cloud is not because I don't want to share. A private cloud is because I need to protect the information we have. So again, you've got to have sophistication in the case you make for what you're selling and the service you're providing. So when we look at that return on investment, it's not just the monetary piece. We went with a private cloud for the new GI Bill because of an agility and a speed. So we deployed this system on 3-month increments. So every 3 months we had customer-facing functionality and capability out to the veteran. Did not have a workforce who could do that, did not have an infrastructure that could do that. So our return on investment was speed to market, was speed to ability, and it gives us then the opportunity to make some decisions. Do you then make the investments in your internal organization to bring you up to that capability and transfer it in? Or is the return on investment still there? So you did it initially because you're first into the market, you're going to pay a premium, but the premium isn't on a bottom line that's just dollars and cents. It's a bottom line based upon agility and capability on a time domain. So think about it in those terms. When you bring your offering to the market, don't just say, well, it's cheaper. Right? That's a hard thing to prove when you're talking about a private cloud. Public cloud, I think you can make the case. The numbers are there for that. Private cloud, it's a little bit harder. I think we have a ways to go before that happens. But again, it depends on what service you're making, what offering you're making, and look at how do you do it hybrid. How do you meet that cost piece by keep the private inside for the data you got to keep, and if that's 1%, great, and 99% is outside, you may be able to make the model there in terms of what that return is. So don't be one-dimensional, be sophisticated in terms of how you make the case. It's more than just dollars, it's speed to market, it's capability to bring your workforce up.
We're in the yellow, so we're going to get hit by the traffic cam. So Kevin, if you could chime in with a little thought on the ROI.
I'll connect 2 of them. How about this? Interoperability, absolutely important for us at the USPTO based on the fact that when we look at cloud bursting, we want to have some options going forward. We're going through a huge program to rethink and redo the way patents are being done and trademarks from a system perspective. These 2 missions of the agency are extremely important and very focused on systems. So when we talked about value, I know at the end of the day it's an ROI thing. The PTO is set up like a business. Everything we do is directly tied to intake, value of the intake, and lowering dependency of patents and trademarks going through. And those are our numbers. We can clearly cut and show when we have increases in speed or increases in agility how it helps the bottom line. So we have a different view of it. We have a need to manage a very fluctuating system demand. It's quarterly. You can imagine other agencies have it too. Every quarter, everyone's trying to do work at the last minute. It just happens. And it's a matter of how much work can we chunk in that last minute for that quarter. And it seems a little ridiculous, but that's a tremendous amount of financial value for our agency. That's not necessarily, when you look at it, a clear-cut bottom line. Is it cheaper? Well, it's more, can we do more in a quicker amount of time and improve our pendencies? So it's a little bit of a different model.
Thank you, Ken. Tom?
So just quickly, I would echo everything that's been said. I come from the private sector, so return on investment is very important to me. It's been pounded into me for my whole adult career, so I'm a big believer in it. I think that the value should be also metriced and measured, and so it should be included in the return on investment calculation. And we are looking for value. We're looking for security and stability. We have significant uptime requirements. We must be up 7/24. And so our requirements for secure and highly available environments are very important.
And I would echo Tom's echo in that it is a return on investment, it is a return on value, return on mission. I guess what I would argue is in this fund budget world that we're in and moving into more and more, it's making us all enjoy working in the federal service. What it's also doing, though, is it's saying, okay, I'm always going to have 10 pounds of requirements, 10 pounds of mission things that need to get done. And instead of maybe having $9 to go get that work done, maybe I'm only going to have 5, right? So if I can find better ways to be more efficient, get a bigger return on investment, reduce time to market, get better security, more interoperable, what can I do with the savings or the the cost avoidance? I can reinvest that back into those requirements. And that delivers more mission value to the organization. So I would argue if we do it better up front, we transfer again, another message point, out to the vendor community to share that capital expense exposure, we can reinvest more back into the business and get the mission value that we're really looking for.
Thank you, Keith. Well, Little Bird has told me we may have found some minutes here for Q&A. So we have a couple here to start with. So we'll open it up to a few questions from the audience, but I also want to point out that SIIA has asked the CIOs on this panel, as well as some of the other folks that we invited that could not participate, that maybe participate on regular webinars on some of these topics that we've hit and maybe just scratched the surface on. So we invite the folks here to join us on that, as well as you to join us when you see the promotions coming out. Join us on those webinars, and we'll have more Q&A at that time. Do we have any questions? There we go. The mic is right behind. Please identify yourself and who your question might be for.
Interested in, and as a taxpayer, relieved to hear the emphasis that you put on portability when you're moving stuff to the cloud. It's obviously important. But I was also intrigued by the idea that when you're talking about cloud, some of the highest value areas you talked about involve business process management, workflow, and so forth. And that's, as you know, an area in which we really don't have clear standards. They're working on it. I'm just wondering how you go about kind of owning that IP, as the phrase was used multiple times, absent standards in a way that really makes it cost effective for you to avoid that lock and being able to pick up and move your IP.
I guess I can answer some of that. So I actually have a fairly broad portfolio inside my agency. One of the groups I have is my ITSMO. So I have an entire organization, about 25 people strong, dedicated purely for business process enhancements and improvement. We've got 4 spirals this year. 3 teams going out with a 4-spiral series of events to include things like asset management, problem management, service catalogs, a whole list of all of those idle best practices. And as importantly, we're not doing it for ourselves. We're doing it for the department. We are sharing it across the rest of the federal space as well. I mean, we are routinely getting calls. So what we're doing is we're documenting this process and we're sharing it and we're embedding it in each and every one of those systems. Because you're absolutely correct, sir. At times, the place that we're going to get those efficiencies from are by driving inefficiencies out of the business process. If I can go there, and one of the things we did inside the construct of that rapid access computing environment race was we streamlined what we characterize as the path to production. It does me no good to spin up a VM and hand it over to a user if it still takes me 6 months or 8 months or 12 or 18 months to get through the accreditation process. So what we've got inside the agency, and we're doing it writ large with the rest of the department, is trying to streamline those business processes to make sure it's an easier, more efficient way of doing business. Everything from taking my information assurance process and embedding enterprise architecture in there at the same time so I get one holistic view, and then I spin that out into the exact same team that's doing business process improvement, because all three of those groups work for me inside the agency. They're all working together to make sure I've streamlined those processes. And that's actually where we believe we're going to be able to save, become much more efficient. I mean, recognize DISA has done massive consolidations. When we started this data center consolidation effort in the early 90s, we had 194 data centers, so we're down to 14. I mean, so we've done a lot of this streamlining and consolidation. We clearly recognize that the next opportunity is in this business process management.
So taking it from a more boots on the ground standpoint, I've talked about the GI Bill. Your point about standards in the business side, business process side or business mapping side, it really isn't there. It's not as mature as it needs to be. So we ended up basically picking the rules engine we will use across that cloud, right? So until the standards are there, we had to lock into a particular vendor. But we deploy that application into that cloud. So when we go to another provider, the application moves over. It wasn't our preferred path, but until we have a common standard out there, and we think we picked a platform that actually is pretty close to what the standard will be. So we're going to have to do some post changes, if you will. So we've had to do that, right? We couldn't wait for the standards community to get their act together in that particular sector. We picked a product. That product basically deploys in our cloud. And instead of doing a product for every one, the GI Bill, the platform we used, that architecture is actually the lead architecture for all of the transformation projects at the VA. So GI Bill rolled out in terms of the education benefit. We're coming right behind with the whole full pension piece. Those are going into that same architecture. So it's that same platform. It's the same reutilization that we're going to go with. So again, my pitch for standards and standardization and coming to a common agreement on things, it allows us to use the cloud truly at the point where I'm buying the drink. Right now, you really can't. I've got to place some pieces in there to make sure it runs in the cycle. And we're probably going to run out of time on questions. Nick, I think you're sitting over there somewhere. I have a gentleman I brought with me. I unfortunately have to dash at the end of this as well as some others. So if you give Nick your card with some questions, we'll make sure we get back to you. Nick,
right.
if you could raise your hand.
We also wanted to say to the folks in the audience, thank you all for your time. Obviously, your time is valuable to you and your teams, but we also want to express deeply how much we appreciate you guys spending the time with us here today. We will also, and maybe through the SIIA blog and Twitter space, if you have questions, we ask you to engage in that environment. We'll try to funnel the questions back to the folks on the panel as best we can, or their staff members. Some will join us here afterwards. But we want to thank you guys very much for your time today.
Thank you.